When it comes to sentencing KKK members, there's one thing they all seem to share: a complete lack of remorse.
Smiling. I don't know why you're smiling.
Because I can.
Well,
Because I can. It's not a crime to smile.
This one even had the nerve to ask the judge if he was also in the KKK.
Are you some type of racist? Are you a secret Ku Klux Klan member?
Bold move for someone about to spend the rest of his life in a cell. Another proudly declared that killing her victim was the best day of her life.
Do you have any regrets?
I have no regrets. Killing that pedophile was the best day of my life.
But every now and then, one of them surprises everyone by actually feeling bad about their actions.
I'm very sorry. I did a terrible thing that day. I shot and killed people because they were black.
Welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most shocking, intense, and unforgettable stories from American history. It involves the violent deaths of members of one of the most dangerous hate groups in the country, the Ku Klux Klan, right in the middle of a courtroom. This chilling tale shows how deep-seated hatred, racism, and revenge can lead to fatal consequences, even in what is supposed to be a place of justice. Viewer discretion is strongly advised, as this video will cover disturbing material related to racially motivated violence and courtroom murders. The history of the Ku Klux Klan. Before we delve into the brutal courtroom killings, it's essential to understand the Ku Klux Klan's dark history. Founded in 1865 by Confederate veterans in Tennessee, the Klan became one of the most infamous organizations in American history. Its members promoted white supremacy, terrorism, and violence against African Americans, immigrants, Catholics, Jews, and other minority groups. Their goal was to instill fear through intimidation tactics, lynchings, and acts of terror, particularly in the southern United States. At its peak, the KKK had millions of members. By the 20th century, its influence began to wane, but the group continued to commit violent acts of racial hatred. As legal systems and civil rights movements advanced, many of the group's most dangerous members were brought to justice. However, even in the courtrooms designed to deliver that justice, some Klan members faced a brutal end at the hands of vigilantes, victims, or even their fellow members. The rise of courtroom vigilantism. Courtrooms are places where people seek justice through legal processes, but sometimes the courts themselves become arenas for violent retribution. When individuals feel that the justice system has failed them or that the crimes committed are so heinous, they may take the law into their own hands. This happened more than once with members of the KKK, where courtroom hearings became the scene of deadly confrontations. In many cases, the victims of KKK violence or their families had to confront these members face-to-face in court. Imagine being in the same room with someone responsible for lynching, murdering, or terrorizing your loved ones. The intense emotions, coupled with decades of racial tension, sometimes boiled over in ways that led to shocking acts of revenge right in the courtroom. The infamous case of Joseph Paul Franklin. One of the most infamous stories involves Joseph Paul Franklin, a white supremacist and KKK member who went on a racially motivated killing spree in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Franklin was responsible for multiple murders across the U.S., targeting African Americans, Jews, and interracial couples. His hatred was fueled by Klan ideologies, and he considered himself a lone wolf on a mission to start a race war. Franklin was eventually caught and brought to trial, but the courtroom proceedings did not go as expected. During one of his court appearances, a relative of one of his victims, unable to contain their grief and anger, lunged at Franklin in an attempt to attack him. Security was barely able to subdue the situation, but it was a clear indication of how deep the wounds of racism and violence ran in the hearts of those affected. While Franklin survived this confrontation, other KKK members would not be so fortunate in court. The case of J.B. Stoner and the courtroom retribution. J.B. Stoner, another notorious figure in the KKK, was known for his involvement in bombings of African American churches and his unapologetic advocacy for white supremacy. Stoner was an active Klan member for decades, and his violent acts left deep scars in communities throughout the South. In the late 1970s, Stoner was finally brought to trial for a bombing that destroyed a black church in Birmingham, Alabama. The bombing killed multiple people, and the case was a landmark in the struggle for justice against KKK violence. However, what made this case even more explosive was the courtroom drama that unfolded. Family members of the bombing victims, who had waited over 20 years for justice, sat in the courtroom during the trial. Tensions ran high as witnesses recounted the horror of the bombing, and the atmosphere was thick with emotion. As the trial came to a close, chaos erupted. One of the family members, unable to bear hearing Stoner's lack of remorse and his vile, racist rhetoric, leaped over the courtroom railing and attacked him. Punches were thrown, and in the chaos that followed, the courtroom descended into pandemonium. While Stoner survived this attack, it was a clear sign of how deeply KKK violence had scarred the victims' families, driving them to acts of desperation. The killing of Ku Klux Klan member Edward Donald. Edward Donald was a mid-ranking member of the KKK who had been involved in numerous violent actions targeting African Americans in the early 1980s. His involvement in cross-burnings, assaults, and other acts of terrorism was well known in his local community in Mississippi. Donald's reign of terror finally came to an end when he was arrested and charged with the murder of an African American man. During his trial, the court was filled with members of the local black community, many of whom had suffered at the hands of the Klan. Families of victims and survivors packed the courtroom, waiting to see justice finally served. But what transpired shocked the entire nation. As Donald sat in court awaiting sentencing, a member of the victim's family, who had been simmering with rage throughout the trial, suddenly pulled out a concealed weapon. In front of horrified onlookers, the family member opened fire, killing Donald instantly. The courtroom erupted into chaos as people scrambled for cover. Donald's death, though a brutal act of vigilantism, was seen by many in the community as an act of long overdue justice. The shooter was immediately arrested, but the incident sparked national conversations about whether the legal system was equipped to handle the deep-seated racial tensions that Klan members had left in their wake. Segment 6. The Case of John George, a man driven to revenge. John George was another Klan member whose hateful actions would lead to his own violent end in court. George had been involved in the lynching of a black man in rural Georgia in the 1970s. His trial was one of the most anticipated in the state's history, as the community sought justice for the racially motivated killing. During the trial, the victim's family members had to listen to chilling testimonies about how their loved one had been tortured and killed by George and his fellow Klan members. Emotions ran high throughout the proceedings, with many in the courtroom openly weeping as the gruesome details of the lynching were recounted. Then, in a moment that shocked the nation, the brother of the victim rushed toward George during a recess in the trial and attacked him with a knife. The assault was brutal and swift, leaving George fatally wounded before court security could intervene. The incident left the community in shock, with some calling the act justifiable revenge, while others condemned the killing as an act of lawlessness. The consequences of courtroom vigilantism. These shocking incidents of KKK members being killed or attacked in court raised serious questions about the nature of justice and the deep emotional toll of racially motivated violence. While many of the families who attacked Klan members in court were driven by an understandable rage, the consequences were severe. These acts of violence led to their own legal battles, with family members facing murder charges and long prison sentences for taking justice into their own hands. Courtrooms are supposed to be places where justice is served impartially, but when the legal system is perceived as failing, people sometimes resort to violence. In the case of KKK members, the anger and grief felt by victims' families were often compounded by decades of racial tension, injustice, and fear. These acts of courtroom vigilantism also highlight the ongoing racial divide in America, where many African American communities felt that the legal system did not adequately protect them from the violence perpetrated by the Klan. The deaths of KKK members in court were symbolic of the broader frustration with a system that had long been complicit in upholding racial inequality. Final thoughts. In conclusion, the brutal deaths of KKK members in court serve as a stark reminder of the emotional and psychological toll that racial violence can take on victims and their families. These stories highlight the fine line between justice and revenge, and how decades of hatred and violence can push people to extreme measures. While courtroom vigilantism is not the answer to the deep-rooted issues of racism and injustice, these cases force us to confront the failures of the legal system to deliver justice swiftly and effectively. They also underscore the need for continued efforts to address the systemic racism that has plagued America for centuries. Thank you for joining us for this harrowing discussion. If you found this video insightful, be sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation about justice, racism, and the long shadow cast by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and we'll see you next time.